Right back to work, Breitbart News Daily. Name of the broadcast. Frank Gaffney joins me, Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy and Vice Chair of the Committee on the Present Danger China. SecureFreedom.org, CounterJihad.com, PresentDangerChina.org are the websites to find what Frank is up to. Now, Frank, we've got a lot of big issues to get to. And one thing that you've been tracking that I want to an update on is something that we discussed last week, which is the Chinese companies that are getting the retirement funds of military personnel and government employees, which is frightening and needs to stop. And you got a big letter out with 6 very influential veterans. When is this letter from? Is this from this week? Calling on the government or calling on the Trump administration to put an end to this. This is pretty exciting. What's going on?
Well, good morning, Alex. Yes, thank you. And again, against the backdrop of what you've been discussing in the past hour, of course, what's happening in China and what's now coming home, I think, to millions of Americans, notably through this NBA debacle. And, of course, some of your terrific reporting on what's happening in concentration camps across China, notably to Uyghur Muslims, but others as well, is the context in which we have to think about a, unbelievable phenomenon. And that is that American investors, many of them doing so through their pension funds or other institutional investments or through indexes. Some of them as private individuals and individual Chinese companies are enabling the Chinese Communist Party to do some of its most horrific actions against, communities inside their own country, faith and otherwise, and now increasingly elsewhere around the world. And interestingly enough, again, more context, Alex, to your question, but just this week, the administration announced that it was blacklisting, putting on what's called the entities list, 28 companies that are Chinese, People's Liberation Army owned and operated, or Chinese Communist Party tied or otherwise engaged in, among other things, the repression of human rights in China. And this is sort of a breakthrough. But the reason this is also important is if we don't want more of this kind of behavior from the Chinese, if we don't want more of the sorts of threats that we're enabling, we have to stop underwriting the companies that are engaged in it. And the immediate question, and specifically this veteran statement and a petition that individual Americans who want to help in this fight could go to at PresentDangerChina.org, is the U.S. government is poised to open up its own employees' pension funds to these kinds of Chinese companies come next year unless we, say, no, we're not going to go there. So we had leaders like Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin, one of the most storied special operator veterans in our country, and Thomas McInerney, a former Assistant Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, very prominent from his many years on Fox News, and Lieutenant Colonel, former Congressman Alan West, for example, and Jessie Jane Duff, a wonderful former gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps, and others have come forward to say, don't do this with our money. The veterans of America's money would be going into these Chinese companies. So, again, PresentDangerChina.org is a place where you can sign the petition to President Trump and to the Congress saying, don't do this. Don't add insult to the injury that's already been created by the underwriting of Wall Street of much of the repression in China and the threat that it's now increasingly posing around the world.
Yeah, and you all are a very powerful audience, and this is a good way to flex your power in this case. So, Frank, tell people where to go again.
PresentDangerChina.org. It's the website.
And the petition's there. Okay.
So, on the Present Danger China, right there on the front
Okay. Okay, great. So tell me about this letter. I love this letter. And there is a lot of great names on it. You've got Alan West, you've got Jerry Boykin, Thomas McInerney. You get a lot of people, Robert Spalding, people who have been on the show or have been cited favorably at Breitbart and some others. When did this letter come out?
Came out on Monday, and let me just call attention to one of the other names, a colonel by the name of Daryl Smith, who I just had the privilege of meeting earlier this week. And one of the things that Daryl Smith has done is, in his capacity as a leader of the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, is get resolutions adopted by their posts here in the District of Columbia, Northern Virginia region, and is now taking the resolutions that object to having veterans' retirement funds put into dangerous Chinese companies. He's taking that up the tape, as they say, to the leadership of the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. And I'm hopeful that we will have those massively influential organizations shortly joining at the national level this fight against the thrift savings plan, as it's called, being turned over essentially to underwriting our enemies. It's just mind-boggling. Think about it. You're talking about the Secretary of Defense. You're talking about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the other chiefs, the combatant commanders, their subordinates in the active duty forces, as well as the retirees, being told they're going to have their pension funds invested in companies that are doing things like, for example, building fortified islands in the South China Sea, or aircraft carriers or submarines or missiles or other things that will be used, I'm afraid, inevitably in due course, if the Chinese Communist Party has its way, to kill their comrades in arms, perhaps them themselves. It's unbelievable, and it's certainly intolerable.
All right, so Frank, let's go big picture, and let's talk a little bit about your reaction to some of the news today. And I want to get your take on the president's Syria move, but I got to ask you about China, because I think this is 10 times bigger story. And somehow, inadvertently, I think a lot of the public who does not consume your content on a regular basis or my content on a regular basis, so many people have just been completely misinformed, ill-informed, uninformed on the oppression that takes place within China. And now all of a sudden, people are going to have to wake up to it. And we've seen some, I think, pretty disgraceful behavior from a lot of our prominent public figures over the last week. But overall, I'm kind of thrilled that people are finally going to have to talk about China for once.
Yeah, the oppression inside China is one thing, Alex. It's horrific. And you've done some great reporting on it at Breitbart, and I really commend you for it, including these most recent revelations about what the Chinese are now doing to Uyghur Muslims, among others, Falun Gong, Tibetans,
Sure.
Christians, which is to engage in horrific repression, some of which we're now being informed includes in some of these prison camps, concentration operations, torture, killing, extreme torture, by the way, killing, rape. I mean, serial rape. There's a quote in one of the pieces that I saw at Breitbart talking about every man and woman under 35 in these camps being raped systemically. I mean, unbelievable. Forced abortions and sterilization, live organ harvesting, infanticide, slavery. I mean, it's unbelievable. And that's what they're doing to their own people. Imagine what they have in mind for us. Well, you don't have to imagine it all together. They're right now telling us, of course, in the context of this National Basketball Association brouhaha, that their restrictions on speech must now be adhered to worldwide. They have to apply to everybody in our country as well as other parts of the world. And they will blackmail us. They will coerce us. They will use corporations. And this is why this idea of investing money in their companies is so crazy. Your pension funds might be tied up in the regime that is going to tell you how to behave, how to live, how to do things or not do things. I mean, nobody in America who loves freedom, who loves the ability to pop off, at our government, at each other, whatever, should want to be subjected to the dictates of communist China, whether it's speech or in any other regard. But that's what's on the line, and we are getting, as you said earlier, Alex, a teachable moment here, and we better make the most of it.
Yeah, we better make the most of it, and we have a chance to really cover. We have a chance to really do a lot of good, because I was harping on last hour. One of, I think, the most important stories of the day yesterday was ESPN banning their people from talking about this issue. They're not banned about talking about how horrible America is and how horrible our police are and how great it is to disrespect our flag, or how racist our president is. ESPN allows that all day long, but God forbid you say something about people who are doing forced abortions and sterilizations and organ harvesting and interning Muslims. If you want to condemn them, no, we can't go there, because China provides such great business for ESPN and or oppressing the people in Hong Kong. So I do think that this is a teachable moment. Yes, exactly. It feels like a massive opportunity for folks who do what you do and what I do.
Well, it is. And the thing is, I'm hoping that a lot of this is not going to be something we have to engage in sort of major educational effort behind, that a lot of this is just going to become apparent to folks who are watching, ESPN, for example, or are just making sense as best they can of what on earth the NBA is doing here. But I think the key piece of it is, and I hope the president and his administration will pull in behind this, is to connect some dots. It's not just the NBA, and it's not just, you're not allowed to talk about Hong Kong. This is the enemy of our time, the existential threat, as Ronald Reagan used to call it, of our generation. And it is confronting us increasingly aggressively, in part because I think they've come to the conclusion, Xi Jinping, the president of China most especially, that the correlation of forces, an old Soviet term, is now such that they can have their way with us, that they're so powerful, that their economy is now so integrated into those of others around the world, that their Belt and Road Initiative, that their military buildup, that their activities in outer space, for heaven's sakes, and the cyberspace domains, and Huawei and 5G, all of these things are now, I believe they perceive, so far advanced that they can get away with dictating to us and imposing their will on us. And if it comes down to force of arms, I think they're increasingly inclined and prepared to do that too. So yes, this is a teachable moment. We must make the most of it, because if it isn't already too late, it's very late indeed.
All right. So again, Frank Gaffney's with me, Center for Security Policy, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com, presentdangerchina.org. And I need to call it
in that regard. Yeah. Alex, sorry, just one last quick point.
Sure.
presentdangerchina.org. One of the things that we've done since we stood this group up in March is provide dozens and dozens and dozens of extraordinarily powerful videos that are mostly very short. Some of them as short as 4 minutes, some of them a little bit longer, but very accessible, very powerful to teach people about what's going on here across the broad front. And I just wanted to commend that to your audience especially. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a great way. I think it really is the way that I think is most accessible for presenting the news, which is important, which is people are kind of liking these sort of 3 to 5 minute videos. We're going to get into that at Breitbart, hopefully right away. But we got plans to do similar things. But that does seem to be the way people are consuming things, particularly younger people. So good for you guys for taking that up. Frank, let me ask you about the China warning brands to accept communism, calling free speech ridiculous. We had a caller last hour who I think was connecting dots that perhaps China's feeling the squeeze from some of the United States economic moves that we've been making. Do you think some of these are connected? Because it does seem like around the world, the more pressure the president puts on various countries, whether it be North Korea or whether it be Iran, it does seem like the rhetoric always gets more hysterical and sort of unhinged. It's usually a good sign but again, so many of these countries are always hysterical and unhinged when it comes to the United States. So is there anything new here we should know about?
Well, one of the things that is new for sure, Alex, is that Deng Xiaoping, one of the most important Chinese leaders, after Mao, helped open up China to much of what we've been talking about, those infusions of capital, those infusions of technology, yes, the support at the political level and otherwise. Deng Xiaoping had a motto calling upon the Chinese to hide and bide, meaning to conceal what their purposes were, their agenda was, and to steal a march on their adversaries, take advantage of them, specifically us. Xi Jinping has changed course. And I think he began that really before Donald Trump started squeezing China. But it's definitely ramping up now. And again, I think it is important, certainly, but I think probably net helpful that they're now letting the mask slip. The true character of the communist regime and its global ambitions are becoming more and more apparent, not just to countries that are being effectively colonized through this so-called Belt and Road Initiative, but those that are increasingly being threatened in much the way that you just described. You will not say such things. You will not do such things. You will not get business with us if you defy us. I mean, these are the sorts of things that I think will hopefully help the American people understand the true existential character of this threat and the necessity of doing what Donald Trump is doing, which is trying to disengage us from China and prepare for worse to come so that we can hopefully deter what the Chinese have in mind.
That's great answer, Frank. Let's turn focus to Syria. So again, the world melted down. The president announced that he was going to move some troops around. Now, I have a two-part question. First of all, I want to get your sense of whether or not the president's move will end up being productive, and then second of all, I want to get you to start thinking through what are the possible scenarios that could take place, considering that it is there is some significant risk with this move. I'm of the camp that I'm in the wait and see camp. So I think you've been listening to the show, so you know that I'm not sure how big of a deal it's going to be either way. But I do know that the media loved just trying to trash the president over it. But I don't want more chaos or instability in the region. So I want to get your sense of what you think are the possible scenarios that could take place.
Well, the biggest wild card in the deck at the moment is the Turks.
Yes.
And Recep Tayyip Erdogan is no ally of ours. We should be very clear about that. I see the president is going to have him come to the White House sometime in the course of this month. But I hope that's off if the Turks do what they're now teeing up to do, which is to invade Syria in force and drive Kurds out of what they consider a new safe zone in northeastern Syria and kill a lot of them in the process. I'm worried, I have to say, Alex, that we've perhaps encouraged that, or certainly at least not discouraged that kind of conduct by the Turks, and it will be very problematic if that is unleashed. But what pains me most about this, I have to say, and I'm not for endless wars, I'm not for having the United States military engaged all over the place if it's not helpful and necessary, but this is one of those places, it seems to me, where in part, thanks to President Trump and the way he, has reconfigured our forces in that country, it's a very small number of folks. You mentioned 50 people who are in the way and they're going to be moved, and maybe it's 1,000 all told. There's no huge demand among the American people, I think, to have those 1,000 people out of Syria. There just isn't. And my concern is that the removal of those 50 from a place where they were helping to deter a Turkish invasion sounds crazy, but it's a tripwire. It's a psychological effect. It's the thought that the Turks would have to confront American forces if they did move in. That is perhaps now being removed and perhaps now going to create an invitation of the sort at least perceived to be an invitation on part of the United States to go ahead and really change what's happening on the ground there in a way that I think will be very contrary to our interests. So I would prefer to have us practice what the Roman general Sulla famously prescribed as sort of the best model for conducting one's international affairs, and that is be no better friend and no worse enemy.
Okay, so let me propose something, that we know that the president does not conduct his foreign policy in public the same way Barack Obama did. We always know that there's something behind what the president's moves are. Like this news cycle was, it was so intense for half a day, and then people realized it kind of wasn't as big of a move. Even if you're correct, Frank, even if you're correct that there was no necessity for doing this. It seems like first of all, he said we can always go back and blast. I like how he added blast, by the way. I think he's put Erdogan on notice in some ways, saying that he's not opposed to using economics and even military force to push back if he does try to do some sort of a massive invasion. But he's also drawn out a lot of people, even Democrats. You're seeing a lot of warmongering, even from far left people. I was citing AOC earlier. Now, all of a sudden is now loves war. Like, it just dawned on her yesterday that she now loves war just because Trump opposes it. And I always feel like that there's sometimes a calculus behind his moves. I'm not saying it's 4D chess, but he's got these instincts, Frank, where he does some things and it does draw out certain people and it clarifies certain things that perhaps we don't have crystallized at this point in the news cycle.
That may be, Alex. My principal concern is that an awful lot of wars begin with miscalculations.
Sure.
And the thought that we may have conveyed to Erdogan that it's okay for him to invade northeastern Syria, killing in the process a lot of people who we have been fighting alongside of, and frankly, they've been doing most of the fighting for,
True.
I think, our general benefit, the Kurds. And to say to them, look, we'll come back in and blast you, or we'll destroy your economy if you do something we don't like, kind of tees up a degree of uncertainty about, so what can I get away with and what can't I get away with? And I think that there could be miscalculations that arise from that. I just as soon have the Turks on notice, don't even think about coming into this place. But I think the president felt, I don't know for sure, but my sense is in that conversation with Erdogan last weekend, that he felt that Erdogan was going to come in anyway, and it would be better to get our guys out of the way. But I think there's still an opportunity to deter the Turks, and I would hope that that's what we do.
Yeah, and I think we will. Here's the thing: the president also might feel, Frank, that some of the economic moves that he's made with Iran and China have worked. They've been effective, and so why wouldn't they be effective with Turkey, who really has there's a lot of weakness within the Turkish ranks because, again, they're still sort of recuperating from that coup that lasted about 15 minutes 2 years ago, that was one of the wildest news days I remember in my 10 or 11 years here at Breitbart, Frank. I'm sure you remember it well when there was the kind of failed coup, which was over before we knew it. But there's
my assessment of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised because it was such a weak effort. But again, it doesn't feel like Turkey really is strong militarily at this point.
Well, they're stronger than anybody else that's there in force at the moment. They'll kill.
But again, how many factions are there in Syria? There's like 10 factions, right? So if there's going to be 10 factions,
that's one of the reasons that they'll be, I think, very lethal if they do go in. But Alex, just quickly, I think
sure.
That was all about consolidating power for that coup business for Erdogan. It led to the purge of his opponents, fellow Islamists, by the way, Fethullah Gulen and the people that he has placed all over the Turkish government. And that was accomplished. And I think he's consolidated power. I think there's a greater restiveness on the part of his people. And if he gets into a messy war, they may well say, get out of here. But for the moment, the trouble is, I think that he will be working against our interests as he is doing more or less generally. And I believe that the United States does need to be seen as a reliable friend to those who fight alongside us. and to be a formidable foe, and not just rhetorically, but formidably disposed to oppose those who are not our friends. And I would put Recep Tayyip Erdogan at the top of that list. And by the way, of course, you've got Iran, you've got the Russians, you've got Bashar Assad's regime, all of whom are looking to see how they can benefit from whatever it is we decide to do, especially if it's bug out. So there's a lot riding on this, and I think that
so Frank, I have to make one connection here, and you've been really generous with your time as always, and I always get I've been getting more carried away because I do find Frank to be one of the more interesting guys in Washington. But let's talk about NATO's role in all this, because technically Turkey's a NATO ally, and I think you and I kind of find Turkey to be a pretty disgusting regime, Erdogan's regime, who would if Erdogan was in charge of planet Earth, he would have an Islamic caliphate with him at the head. And so again, technically NATO ally, and that's complicated because NATO tends to be, I think there's a lot of grift off of the Americans' back that takes place there, but it does make it so that, as you said, if they're going to do any sort of military action, does it tie our hands? Does it make things more difficult for us? What is NATO's role in this scenario?
This is a critically important point. Very quickly, two things. One, NATO has no means of getting rid of Turkey. It's a NATO ally by default at this point, even though it is behaving increasingly not as one, simply because there's no mechanism within NATO's structure for removing countries from the alliance. Secondly, Alex, and this is a hugely important point, we don't have time to talk about it today, but I hope we might next week, Turkey is actively involved in the Islamist, I call it Sharia supremacist, Muslim Brotherhood-dominated effort to subvert America from within. It's a big story that has gone almost completely unnoted. We need to focus on that because it's another manifestation of just how much they are an adversary, not an ally of ours now.
Frank Gaffney, wonderful. And we can pick that up next week when you join me again next Wednesday. Frank Gaffney, Center for Security Policy, PresentDangerChina.org. Wonderful stuff, Frank. See you soon.
Thanks so much, Alex.
We'll be right back.